Hey, and welcome again to the Glass Prison Podcast, a show that explores important stories with a unique perspective. It's no secret men rule the world, but women are catching up, and they're making strides in achieving equal treatment and credit for their contributions to society, because for decades, women have advocated for their rights to be seen as equals in the workplace, demanded equal pay with their male colleagues, and today, they've even surpassed their male colleagues in average compensation in many industries and in many metropolitan areas. Their involvement in STEM is increasing every year, which also means the average woman today has more financial freedom than she did yesterday, and continuing in that direction. And over time, women have slowly gained their autonomy culturally and financially. This is why many consider the female liberation movement to be a significant milestone for global justice and equality, a true example of how a disenfranchised group in this world can unite under a common cause to fight for their freedoms. Although I must admit, in many places, there's still a lot to be done. We should celebrate how far we've come. And to every woman, this movement meant something different about what that freedom means and how it should be exercised. But it is a woman's choice to make her own decisions in life, and that reality should always be protected. But most recently, we are witnessing a shift in social dynamic and treatment of this movement and its reception in society. Some have criticized the movement for perturbing the concept of just equality and abusing their influence. So in response, the movement may have inspired an undesired outcome. A call for the opposite team to start fighting for what they deemed unjust. And this response in all its forms took the internet by storm.
I'm saying you can't sit as a man and afford the luxury of saying, I have a mental health issue today, I'm sad today, I'm stressed today, I'm emotional today, I can't work.
So everyone has their own definitions of what it means to be a real man, and we all fall for it trying to prove ourselves. So many men are confused and scared, but they don't know how to express emotion.
Because you will lose against the men who don't do that. And the male world is more competitive than you could possibly imagine. And it's the women who pick the winner.
Men kill themselves 5 times more than women. 80% of homicide victims are men. We will die trying to prove ourselves. It's weird and sad. Like, I'm in my 20s and I think about slapping people for respect on a daily basis. That's insecurity.
Andrew Tate, Joe Rogan, and Dr. Jordan Peterson are considered male icons for better or worse depending on your opinions and what side of the political aisle you choose to sit. You deem them as heroes or villains. But one thing is for sure, their popularity in the last 4 years, it's not an anomaly. These guys have a larger reach and following than the vast majority of public media outlets today. Most of their followers, but not entirely, made up of male fans. Many believe this to be a non-story. If you believe the mainstream media, this has highlighted a recurring concern of misogynistic messaging, anti-liberal propaganda, and a host of other progressive concerns. The story to be told here isn't the angle you would expect. Here in the Glass Prison, we do things differently, because the popularity of these public figures is not the cause of the concern, but a symptom of a much larger issue. A problem that should equally concern women as it does men, about what is inspiring the bitter social warfare between men and women that have a lot in common and a world to share with each other. So since the topic of feminism has been championed and criticized for so many years, we decided on focusing on the other side of the coin. In this episode, we will focus on the male crisis, the issue that no one saw coming, but will have to quickly solve before it's too late. This is the Glass Prison Podcast. Enjoy. Now, talking about any gendered topic is a difficult issue to navigate. There's personal beliefs, politics, fear of ridicule from both sides, ostracization on Twitter, maybe being cancelled. It's a murky space to choose a position and argue for it, because there will always be somebody who vehemently disagrees with you. It's easy to confound dialogue regarding a sensitive topic with the preaching of one side over the other. We're not picking a hill to die on here, just a unique perspective. I'm sure that everyone listening has at least one male or female loved one. When you're listening to this episode, all we ask is to listen with an open mind and heart, thinking of what that could mean for that loved one in your life. And moving forward, when you hear the term men or women, we are speaking based on averages and where the bell curves skew. And naturally, those bell curves often overlap. But just to clarify, the term in this episode doesn't mean all men, and women doesn't mean all women. Now that that's out of the way, let me ask you this. Who is better at school, boys or girls? We asked this question to some of our fellow students at university, and here were their answers.
Education-wise, I think women, to be honest.
I think there's a balance of the two. There are women who are really exceptional performance and men as well.
Is that probably about the same? Probably about the same? Probably about the same too, yeah.
I don't think there's such a big difference on performance, especially because you can't really pinpoint a specific outcome, especially because people will always have weaknesses and strengths in certain topics and subjects. So.
Now, for the majority of them, they think it's relatively balanced. I don't blame them for thinking that way. It might have been true when they were in school. But in 2022, they would be wrong. In fact, in a fair school environment, I'm sorry to say that your kindergarten teachers were right. Girls are in fact better than boys. This was a notable victory for the education reform efforts back in the 70s to improve girl performance in school. And this trickled down to the economy, where qualified female leaders emerged and became real role models for many little girls. But now the worrying part is we still have a difference between boys and girls in the modern day. And it's not marginal. It's not even close. The education reforms in the 70s attempted to cover a 13 percentage point deficit between boys and girls, and that prompted Congress to act. Now the difference is 15 percentage points with the roles reversed. The teenage boys and young men are forfeiting college. Declines of male enrollment were 7 times higher in men than women during COVID. Many college campuses are seeing a 2-to-1 ratio of women to men. The reform is not the problem. It was supposed to equal the playing field, and that it did. But no one is sure why men are underperforming the classroom, and to be honest, no one seems to care. There are other, much more alarming signs of this concerning trend for guys. I want you to think of the suicide victims you know in your life. I personally know 3. All men. Because men are more likely to commit suicide. About 300% to 400% more likely than women. Research shows that even though the attempts of suicide are largely female, men have a higher level of intent. That is why when they attempt to commit, they make sure there's no possibility of survival. 1 in 5 men do not have a single close friend. 3/4 of men polled in the UK say they suffer from stress, anxiety, or depression. I say estimated because all the studies that have attempted to measure the precise figures understand that the reality is much, much bleaker, as a man may not know and or admit to the issue. Men are suffering, they really and truly are. And so far, everyone seems to be blind to this fact, even though it is so clear everywhere around us. Some victims are radicalized or left in vulnerable positions, making them addiction prone. To smoking, to drugs, to alcohol, to pornography. In the most extreme cases, some men have created toxic groups who share their afflictions, part of what they call the manosphere, where men share toxic ideas of drowning in their own sorrow, shunning those who interact or promote women, and preach degeneracy. Anything and everything that a discerned man would do to escape the reality they live in or feel a sense of community, or engage with similar ideas on social media. And in today's world, these men, unfortunately, are not an entirely small minority. So why? Why have we forsaken these people? Why does November pass so swiftly with little to no attention as to what these struggling people go through? Why is this the first time you hear about the extent of the problem? During my research on this episode, there were many interesting responses to these statistics and facts. Some thought that men should seek help, talk to someone, which of course is a reasonable suggestion, but it's a common belief that the single reason men do not find help is the stigma associated with finding help through therapy. Some would go as far as to say it's the result of fragile or toxic masculinity. This is a widespread idea, even among therapists and experts. In fact, many sources we looked into said the very same thing. But what I found after I fell into the rabbit hole of the male mental health world is that I learned why that wasn't the whole story. The sources that mentioned that men choose not to open up because they want to be a man is not an internal response. The truth is, men do not choose to be emotionally burdensome solely because it makes them seem more manly for two reasons. One, society doesn't empathize with men. And second, it doesn't know how to treat men with their problems. Let me explain both points for a moment. The proportion of men who suffer from mental illness is incredibly high, and not all of them are trying to bottle it because they are supposed to be a man. In fact, if you look into the Reddit thread of "I cried in front of my partner," it shows us a glimpse of the reception of a man who needs help. A study showed that women's level of respect for men decreases if they ever saw them cry once. To further illustrate the point, let's do a little experiment. Take a moment to type the following into Google. "My husband yells at me so much." The Google suggested answer is a crisis helpline. No surprise there. Frequent yelling is associated with a higher potential of abuse, if not physical, then most definitely emotional in couples. So it's great that Google suggested that as a resource to help people identify that they are not in a good environment and relationship with their partner. But what happens when you switch the word husband for wife? "My wife yells at me so much." If you're in Canada, the Google suggested answer, and I kid you not, is the reason she yells a lot is that she wants to feel heard, and here are ways to react appropriately. Listen, both men and women should find safe outlets for understanding an abusive relationship, physical and emotional. And this is only one systemic barrier that I can demonstrate through the podcast to show you the obstacles that face men seeking to understand and process their mental health. It is clear that since many men do not have a single close friend, it is difficult for them to form support systems. And even if they do have friends or a partner, there won't be many who are receptive to their pains. In fact, a common narrative, if you were to read anecdotal accounts of male attempts to find help, is that people tend to think their manhood grants them so much more privilege that if they fail for whatever reason in life, they deserve it. So men, do not believe they are too manly to find help. It's because oftentimes the help isn't there at all. The main reason we even looked into anecdotal accounts is because the professionals in this space admit time and time again that male mental health and reasons for their lack of involvement in therapy is not well understood. In fact, that according to the American Psychiatric Association, their diagnostic manual doesn't even include the common symptoms men express differently when depressed. And that's not talking about all the other mental health illnesses that men face. Not only that, but men are regarded as having poor mental health literacy. They rarely identify the signs of a true mental health crisis. Men physically identify less with their emotions as well. In an experiment that sat down men and women to view the words love, compassion, and empathy, and other associated words, women had an average of 13 hyperactive areas in the brain, whereas men only had 3. In fact, men are biologically less emotionally aware in general, an ability that some evolutionary psychologists claim historically was an asset in overwhelming circumstances of war and hardship. Making quick decisions and processing emotions later was vital for the survival of the tribe and family during a crisis. Notice that it doesn't say that men feel their emotions less intensely, rather that they don't identify with their emotions as much. Fascinatingly, this is a trait highly selected for in men by women. The stoicism men's cool helped women view men more as protectors in history. Here is the interesting take. Counterintuitively, this actually opens up a new possibility for therapy for men, an idea called positive or mature masculinity, intending to promote the benefit of proper masculine traits. A meta-analysis of this issue of hundreds of studies argued that instead of convincing men to change, instead of telling them that masculinity is their problem, maybe it's better to make a mental health system more catered towards them. Instead of convincing men that masculinity is the reason they do not seek help, maybe we should stop telling men they are inherently defective, and rather help them hone and discipline their strengths. Because even if they do not believe in this, it's clear that the people who they approach believe that they're supposed to be much, much stronger than they actually really are during times of need. This is a similar issue to the issue of female patients in medicine. Because much of the science was based on men, the medical diagnosis of doctors and their prescriptions failed to offer them adequate care. Because female physiology is different, and sometimes their symptoms and illnesses were different too. This is also why Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Reasons for Life, An Antidote to Chaos, was so popular among disaffected men. Regardless of whether you agree with Peterson on some issues or his viewpoints, it was clear that his impact was undeniably positive for thousands of men who felt like no one would offer a helping hand on the internet. Many accounts on different websites highlighted the fact that Peterson's book didn't preach to men about denouncing their toxic masculine traits to start healing. According to the readers, the books asked them to reflect on their situations, emotions, and then help them direct their frustrations towards a call to action, to take responsibility to improve, to harness their strength. Even though toxic masculine traits do exist, we cannot objectively use it as a blanket theory for the afflictions of any man, especially those who suffer. Positive masculinity is the scientific equivalent of this book's theme. This idea of self-improvement and finding meaning is an essential axiom to the well-being of any man. And it is only recently that this approach has been examined in therapy. The warning here is that reflection and learning to channel emotions into action sound too close to the statement, man up. But there's a clear difference between the two. The same difference between working hard and being a workaholic, or between don't eat too much and starving yourself. There's a center, a healthy, balanced, mindful center. The other disclaimer is that this is not to say that the help in the form of psychiatric therapy is useless. They are helpful. In fact, there are many more studies supporting the fact that these therapies do help, especially for men who do not understand the nature of their hardship. But we should face reality, what the optimal methods of therapy for men are, and how to recruit them into therapy without obstacle. What we're doing now is not enough. It's not remotely effective in addressing men's mental health issues, and this is why it is time to diversify and give this issue the attention it deserves. To understand that when men are in despair, they look for meaning and a cause to act behind. They look for friends who will support them, not judge them. Support that will truly help and motivate them towards a better future, because the situation is dire with them, with our current services. And that must change. We will take a short break before returning back to talk about the role of privilege in dialogue. I want to tell you about the story of Jeremy Morris. Jeremy Morris is an attorney who represented a man accused of abuse. The man admitted to pushing his girlfriend through a door while he was holding their child. His girlfriend was also being physically violent with him during the altercation. Then, police later arrived and arrested Jeremy's client on battery charges. In court, the police footage showed that the girlfriend admitted to hitting him other times and attempted to swing at him that time he was arrested, laughing that he didn't hurt her, yet he was still being arrested. She was not arrested for her admission. During trial, it was revealed that she had a history of being abusive, not only to her partner, but physically abusive to others as well. It might surprise you to hear that only Jeremy's client went to jail, and afterwards, Jeremy started to deliberate on quitting the legal profession, because the girlfriend was allowed to walk home free, even when she admitted to committing the same crime. But I want to clear the air up here before anyone says I'm being too biased for one side. Pushing anybody through a door is most definitely abuse, which Jeremy's client regretted and is now paying for. But in this case, that somehow overshadowed his relatively more abusive girlfriend, who should have seen an equally harsh sentence at the very least. Yet, she was allowed to walk free. What Jeremy wasn't already familiar with was, this was and currently is the reality for many similar cases. In the US, men get 63% longer jail sentences than women convicted of the same crime of a similar nature. In other court-related injustices, for equally involved parents in the raising of children, the judge is 94% less likely to provide equal custody of children if the mother wishes to isolate the children from their father. Now, This decision is incredibly harmful to the children who do not live with either biological parent or do not see them often, are in increased risk of behavioral problems, drug abuse, and even suicide. Many men adopt substances to cope with the situation. My question is, why is there no uproar? Why are there no TV shows highlighting this issue? Rarely is it talked about in the news, and we rarely see reforms of any nature to address this problem. Frankly, there's a lack of empathy in these matters. So if you made it this far and you think, men deserve this, here's why, even if you are unsympathetic to the cause, even for an entirely selfish narcissistic reason, it is in everyone's benefit to have capable men and a just system. Capable men offer more to the economy and work harder. If only competent men find their way to leadership positions on highly respected places in the economy, then you get better doctors, better lawyers, policemen. You get better products, services, and a quality of life. More present fathers are great for the health of the family and the children's development. This was the same argument for why women should contribute to the workforce, a terrible perspective of why they should join the workforce, but it is better for the economy and money talks, so people listened. But on a personal note, a note that I hope reaches anyone who sweepingly feels bitter about any large group of people, men, women, or otherwise. The principle of senseless hate towards a group because of feeling their existence antagonizes you is a common thematic ideology that Stalin, Mao, and the fascists in Germany whose name rhymes with Adolf Hitler all would most likely empathize with you more than the average person about your feelings. Even though I would like to believe most of us do not senselessly resent the other for ignorant reasons, there is a worrisome nature to our conversations today. The idea that for a group to rise, the other must fall is not remotely true. It's only with vengeful intention would either group fall, and actually naturally, both groups should thrive, as the other group can contribute better to the mutual benefit of the other as explained previously. Across many cultures and for millennia, that was the reality for men and women. It's only in the last 300 years, for better and worse, have we seen organized friction amount between the two. The intention behind the idea of retributive justice, though, which is justice in the way of punishing the aggressor or oppressor in this case, is to emphasize who's the larger victim and who's to blame and therefore pay for their mistakes. This is a general idea that ignores addressing their male and female concerns collectively. To give you an idea of what this looks like, listen to this clip of Jordan Peterson highlighting some uniquely male struggles with an interviewer and her response to that.
The vast majority of wealth is owned by men. The vast majority of capital is owned by men. Women do more unpaid labor.
Very tiny proportion of men, and a huge proportion of people who are seriously disaffected are men. Most people in prison are men. Most people who are on the street are men. Most victims of violent crime are men. Most people who commit suicide are men. Most people who die in wars are men. People who do worse in school are men. It's like, where's the dominance here precisely? What you're doing is you're taking a tiny substrata of hyper successful men and using that to represent the entire structure of Western society. There's nothing about that that's vaguely appropriate.
But I could say equally well that most rape victims are women. Terrible things happen to people of both sexes.
And you could say that with perfect utility, but that doesn't provide any evidence for the existence of a male-dominated patriarchy. It just means that terrible things happen to both genders, which they certainly do.
But there are almost no women who rape men, for example. So that is an asymmetry there in sexual violence.
Well, yes, there's an asymmetry in all sorts of places, but that doesn't mean that Western culture is a male-dominated patriarchy. The fact that there are asymmetries has nothing to do with your basic argument.
No, but you might
This is a trope that people just accept. Western society is a male-dominated patriarchy. It's like, no, it's not. That's not true. And even if it has a patriarchal structure to some degree, the fundamental basis of that structure is not power, it's competence. That's why our society works. It's only when a structure degenerates into tyranny that the fundamental relationships between people become dependent on power.
This is a now famous clip. The conversation, much like every conversation regarding this matter, dissolves into the idea of who holds power and who's the oppressed victim. To be fair to Peterson in this clip, he didn't have that stance to him at all. On the other hand, the interviewer did. She emphasized the asymmetries for one group rather than the other, especially when Peterson insisted that there are clear prejudices in both groups that need to be addressed. This is a complicated issue and a dialogue that isn't rare in 2022. Now, we often see women saying misandrous things and men countering with misogynistic things, as if it were some kind of competition who can rile the other up more and steep to a lower level. The only result of these conversations is mutual destruction of each other's causes. And the casualties are the ones crying for help in either camp. The way I see it, it's not clear that these people care for anyone at all. They see a senseless war waged to prove they are irrefutably right. With the issues facing us today, we should both support each other in our struggles, not compete to see who has it worse. This is not unique to female rights activists. If you take Andrew Tate and Sneeko's approach and statements, it's not hard to see that they're saying some stupid offensive crap every time a camera points their lens towards them. So I would say just pick your role models carefully, because on both sides of the table, anyone who intends to antagonize the other in the absence of honest and sensible discussion is more likely interested in garnering views for their financial gain than anything else. In all seriousness though, what to do about it? The answer is in fact in the clip. It's about what they agreed about. Setting these two's general positions aside for just a moment, they seem to agree that both genders can have it tough sometimes. For men, this meant they were more likely to be victims of violence, war, homelessness, and suicide, and women are more likely to be victims of sexual violence and harassment. We should aspire to be morally just and address all issues without discrimination. This is the key. Because saying men are anything or women are anything might just end up validating sweeping generalizations of all kinds with the same logic. Are Muslim terrorists now? Are black people dangerous? Are Asians bad drivers? If those sounded absurd to you, then we should be careful in applying similar logic to either gender. To finish up, we wanted to share the journey of someone who came to the realization that we shouldn't seek to compete, but rather share each other's struggles. Her name is Casey J. Her TED Talk about this very topic, titled Meeting the Enemy, A Feminist Comes to Terms with the Men's Rights Movement, has garnered over 11 million views. To give you a brief summary, in 2013, she went out to interview men's rights activists for a documentary to shed light on and expose the group she thought was anti-women, who, in her words, continued fighting women's equality. Her experience with these men and what she has learned was anything but that. During interviews, she caught herself many times being unfair in her perception of what her interviewees were telling her about the men's rights movement. They would make statements highlighting male contributions, and she would catch herself competing with them on who's at fault and who has more pressing issues. She didn't like that side of her, especially not when a lot of the concerns these men presented were sincere. When she finally released the documentary, which didn't portray men's rights movements as a cabal of monsters, many protested in front of the theaters it was released in, claiming it was damaging to women and opposing their fight for equal rights. The only thing that it damaged was the narrative they told themselves and made them question their enemy. That documentary humanized men. She was then promptly targeted by the media as part of a smear campaign for her work, and yet she admitted that the hardest part of creating this documentary was not the critics, the protests, or the media's egregious attempt to dehumanize her, but rather the layer of bias she had to peel off while making this documentary. Now, even if you did hear it from me, she delivered this beautiful message much better than I did, so I suggest you watch it yourself and check out the link in the show notes below. But at the end of this episode, I want you to take home Cassie's crucial message about caring for the disaffected regardless of who they are, and in her own words, we have to start truly, openly, and sincerely listening. This was the Glass Prison Podcast. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.